Hi everyone, I was asked to make a short video explaining the conflict that we are seeing in Nova Scotia. And so I'll just jump right in. Commercial fishermen have been blockading and protesting against First Nation fishermen, claiming that First Nations shouldn't be allowed to fish outside of season and that the First Nation fishermen are not using sustainable fishing practices, among other things. On Saturday, October 17, a First Nations lobster facility has been burned to the ground, and images of the fire has been spread all across social media and in news stations across the country. There are also reports of damage and vandalism of First Nations vehicles and other property. Okay, so how did we get here? So in order to explain that, we need to explain what the Mi'kmaq are referring to as their treaty right to fish. For those living in other parts of Canada, you might be familiar with the numbered treaties, which are a series of agreements that Canada has made with First Nations after Confederation. But what about before Confederation? Among the different pre-Confederation treaties are the Peace and Friendship Treaties. So these are a series of agreements that took place between 1725 and 1779, the purpose of which is to maintain peaceful relationships and to support the development and enhancement of Indigenous and non-Indigenous economies. So take note, that's what we're talking about right now, the maintaining of peaceful relationships and the enhancement of Indigenous and non-Indigenous economies. Fast forward a little bit, Canada becomes a nation in 1867. A year later, Canada establishes the DFO, the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, in 1868. Canada's approach has not always been to honor treaty rights. In 1876, Canada introduced the Indian Act, unilaterally without any consultation of Indigenous groups in Canada. And in the years following, the Indian Act restricted the development of Indigenous economies. So we're talking about the introduction of the pass system, which required each First Nation citizen to get a pass from the Indian agent before they can leave the reserve. The permit system, which required a permit before things can be bought or sold from a First Nation. Peasant farming, which restricted First Nation people from buying labor-saving equipment. The Indian Act also restricted First Nations from hiring lawyers. So these are just a few examples of the way that Canada used race-specific policies to hinder the development of the economy of one specific race within Canada. Fast forward again, in 1982, Canada repatriates its constitution from Britain. So the important thing to note here is that Section 35 of this Constitution recognizes and affirms inherent treaty rights. And so that's important because essentially that's recognizing that history did not begin in 1867. Canada is recognizing the treaties and the agreements and the relationships that were built prior to Confederation. So this includes the peace and friendship treaties. What Section 35 essentially means is that these agreements are still in effect today. In 1993, Donald Marshall Jr. went to go fishing for eel. Now, he used an illegal net, he went out of season, and he didn't have a license. So these are the policies that were set by the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. So what that led to was Don Marshall Jr. fighting against these charges and eventually taking this all the way up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, however, ruled in his favor in 1999. So this was a landmark ruling that recognized and affirmed the First Nations' right to fish. It also recognized that First Nations had a right to, a quote, a moderate livelihood. The Supreme Court decision recommended that a certain and transparent regulatory framework be set in place to recognize these treaty rights. The problem, though, is that in the time since that decision up until now, Canada has not pursued developing this regulatory framework. And despite repeated attempts of First Nations groups to press this issue on the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, there's been little to no progress in establishing such an important framework. Also, in the time since then, tensions have been escalating. And so that's where I want to draw your attention to a letter that was written by Senator Murray Sinclair. He is a former chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and he wrote a letter to the Prime Minister about what is happening in Nova Scotia right now. In this letter, he condemns the crimes committed against the First Nations fishermen. He reminds the Prime Minister to recognize and enforce the Criminal Code of Canada. He calls for the protection of First Nation citizens who are currently facing violence without the protection of law enforcement. He also recommends holding law enforcement officers accountable for failing to protect First Nation citizens. He reminds the Prime Minister of Section 35 of the Constitution Act of 1982. And he says, quote, I am disappointed in the Government of Canada's long-term failure to uphold Mi'kmaq constitutional treaty rights through a certain and transparent regulatory framework as the Supreme Court recommended long ago. I want to recommend that every Canadian take the time to read this letter. It's a really good description of where we need to go from here. For those who want to know more information, I recommend checking out some of the resources that I'm going to put in the description of this video, including an APTN documentary called Living Treaties. It's a really important background for those who want to understand this conflict a little bit further. If you find this video useful, I want to encourage you to like, comment, and share. Tag people that you think would find this interesting or useful. And I think it's really important to help Canadians to learn about our Constitution, to learn about our criminal code, and to learn about our treaty rights, because the more informed Canadian citizens are, the better equipped we are to hold our government accountable to prevent conflicts like these from happening in the future. Thanks so much. I'm Jim Thunder from Reconciliation Thunder.